When we talk about beauty, we usually talk about it emotionally. We talk about confidence, aging, self-image, choice. But today I want to zoom out because medical aesthetics isn't just personal. It's also very economic. The global medical aesthetics market is projected to exceed $25 to $30 billion in the next few years. Some projections place it even higher. It's one of the fastest growing sectors in medicine. And when something grows that fast, incentives grow with it. That's not dramatic. It's not cynical. It's just the way that markets work. When demand rises, supply expands. When profits increase, competition intensifies. When competition intensifies, messaging gets louder. There are estimates that there are more med spas in the US than there are McDonald's. Let's just think about that for a second. There are more medical aesthetic clinics than fast food chains. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because there is a demand. There's money, there is scalability. Beauty is emotional, but beauty is also economics. And economics, it shapes behavior, it shapes what devices get developed, it shapes what treatments get pushed, it shapes what shows up on your Instagram feed. It even shapes what conversations happen inside the consultation rooms. We like to think about aesthetics as purely about artistry or empowerment or confidence, and sometimes it is. But it's also inventory, it's also investment, it's financial structures, it's growth projections, it's a return on investment, and none of that is inherently bad. Honestly, innovation often follows growth, but when you understand that this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, it's not just a collection of before and after glamorous photos, you start seeing it a little differently. So, when something scales this quickly, it's also worth asking why. How did we get here, right? How did we get to this point? Part of it's cultural. We live on camera, high definition lenses, front-facing phones, Zoom meetings that we have now. There's also the comparison of social media. Appearances have never been more visual, but part of it is structural. The barrier to opening a med spa in many states is very low, much lower than what people realize. In some states, non-physicians can own an aesthetics practice through management service organizations. Private equity has also entered this space, and franchise models have emerged. Device companies are offering financing structures that make six-figure equipment very accessible. And when financing is available, expansion accelerates. It becomes scalable. And so unlike traditional medicine, aesthetic medicine is largely cash-based. There's no insurance. There are no prior authorizations. There are no reimbursement battles. That makes it very attractive to entrepreneurs, to investors, to large healthcare systems, even people who are outside of medicine entirely. When you combine high consumer demand, cash-based revenue, scalable service models, aggressive marketing, the amplification of social media, you get rapid growth. And rapid growth changes culture. It changes hiring practices. It changes trainings. It changes pricing strategies. It changes the tone of marketing. And so again, none of this is inherently good or bad. It's just economics. But when you understand that aesthetic medicine sits at the intersection of healthcare and beauty and business, you realize that it operates very differently than most people assume. Because it's not just a doctor and syringes or medication. It's capital, it's branding, it's positioning, it's market competition, and that shapes behavior inside the industry, which is what I want to unpack next. Because once you understand how the business works behind the scenes, you start seeing trends differently and you start asking different questions. You start asking, why is this treatment suddenly everywhere? Why does pricing vary so much? Why does one office push prevention at 25 and another one says to wait? Why are trends accelerating? When something becomes a booming industry, culture shifts around it. And that's what I want to unpack today. Not from a place of accusation, from a place just of clarity. And I think I say this differently because I live in two separate worlds. I practice anesthesia. I practice aesthetic medicine. Traditional medicine, it's very heavily regulated. It's insurance-based. It's heavily protocol-driven. Reimbursement controlled. There are prior authorizations. There are coverage battles. There is major hospital oversight. There are layers of compliance. It's slow, it's structured, it's constrained. Aesthetic medicine, it's the exact opposite. It's cash-based, it's market-driven, it's consumer-facing, it's brand-sensitive. There's no insurance company deciding what qualifies somebody for something. There's no hospital committee that's approving the purchase of a laser. There's just demand, and there is supply, and there is choice. That creates freedom. But it also creates market pressure. And when medicine intersects with market pressure, behaviors shift. Not because people are bad, but because incentives matter. And once you understand incentives, you start to understand trends. You start understanding why certain treatments seem like they're exploding overnight and why some devices suddenly are everywhere. You start understanding why messaging is sounding similar across offices no matter where you go, and why restraint becomes much more valuable, not less. So let's talk about this, how it really works behind the scenes, because the business of beauty is shaping more than you think. So you see a new laser suddenly everywhere. That's not random. Medical devices are extremely expensive, so expensive. Aesthetic lasers, they range anywhere from $80,000 to well over $200,000, sometimes even more depending on the configuration. That is not a small purchase. That's not just like a casual addition. That's capital investment. And honestly, what most people don't even realize. These devices are not usually bought outright in cash. They're financed. There are terms. There are usually 5-year terms on them. There are monthly payments. There are trade-in structures. There are also upgrade incentives. And once a practice signs that agreement, there's a fixed monthly cost that's attached to that device every single month, whether it's used or not. Now, this is where economics quietly enters into the treatment room. If you have a 6-figure device with a monthly payment that's attached to it, there's a natural pressure to use it. Not because someone is unethical, but because that's how business works. There's something called a sunk cost bias, a behavioral economics concept that was studied that once you invest heavily in something, you're more likely to justify its use, even if it's subconsciously. So when you see a treatment suddenly being marketed everywhere, it's worth asking, is this innovation or is this adoption pressure? And here's another layer. Device companies compete aggressively. Trade shows, even medical shows for aesthetics, they feel almost like Fashion Week, but for lasers. Every single booth claims that their device has better results and less downtime, more collagen, more revolutionary technology. And innovation, of course, it exists, but so does marketing. So when a device is launched, there's often a surge of early adopters. Then social media starts filling posts and patients start asking for the device, usually by name. And now the cycle starts feeding itself. Demand drives adoption. Adoption drives marketing, and marketing drives demand. Again, not evil, it's just market dynamics. But if you're a patient who's sitting in a consultation room, you may not realize that a part of it is what is being influenced by capital structure. And that doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong. It doesn't just means that it's not purely artistic, which what you might go into it thinking that it's just going to be purely artistic. There's a math behind it. And understanding that changes how you interpret trends. Now we're going to talk about injectables because this is where business becomes quieter, but it's also more consistent. So unlike a laser where there's a large capital purchase, injectables are inventory. They're ordered, they're stored, they're tracked, they're reordered. Every syringe has a wholesale cost to the practice, and that cost varies by product and by volume agreements, but it's not an insignificant cost. When a patient pays for a syringe of filler, let's say, or pays for a unit of Botox, they're not just paying for the product. They're paying for the injector's expertise, they're paying for the consultation, they're paying for the medical training, the overhead of the practice, and yes, the margin. That's not controversial. Every medical service has a margin, but injectables are different from most traditional medicine because they're discretionary, they're consumer driven. There is no insurance company that's approving the dose. There is no hospital billing department. There is no external regulation on quantity. So what determines exactly how much is being used? It's clinical judgment. It's aesthetic philosophy, and sometimes volume models. Some practices operate on high volume, low price structures. Others operate on lower volume, higher margin structures. Neither is automatically unethical, but they just create different incentives for the practice. If your model depends on volume, you need to move more units. But if your model depends on premium positioning, then you need fewer treatments at higher pricing. Both are just different business strategies. Both of those shape aesthetic outcomes. So here's where it gets a little uncomfortable. Injectables are scalable. You can add more syringes to a treatment plan far more easily than you can justify a new surgery. So when trends shift towards fuller cheeks or sharper jawlines, more projection, you have to ask, is this anatomy driven or is this market driven? There was a period, and we all saw it, when faces become, let's say, they became ambitious, right? Larger mid faces, heavier lower thirds, more structure, not softness. And that didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened during an era of social media amplification, before and after virality, and aggressive filler education courses. Education, they're good. But when growth and visibility reward dramatic change, subtlety can lose. And subtlety doesn't photograph as dramatically as volume does, then that's when you start to see a shift in what's being rewarded online. More change equals more engagement. More engagement equals more visibility. And more visibility equals more demand. And again, this isn't accusing practices or people. It's about understanding systems. Because when you understand the systems and the economics that are behind the injectables, you realize something that's important. The syringe itself, it's neutral. The philosophy behind the syringe is not. And when volume becomes normalized, something else happens. Correction cycles begin. Over the past several years, we've been seeing a noticeable rise in dissolving procedures. Patients come in asking to reverse filler that was placed years prior. Sometimes it's because trends change. Sometimes it's because faces change. Sometimes it's because migration becomes visible. Sometimes because what looked good at, say, 30 doesn't look good anymore at 42. And this is where the long game matters. Filler doesn't always disappear exactly when we think it does. There are studies that show MRI imaging that hyaluronic acid fillers may persist longer than it was previously assumed. Not always visibly, but structurally, they're there. So when layering happens over years, especially without a long-term plan, fullness, it can accumulate. Again, this is not necessarily what's bad and what's good. It's just biology plus business plus time. Injectables, they're very powerful tools, but they require extreme restraint. And restraint is not always rewarded in a volume-driven environment. Because honestly, subtle work doesn't trend. Dramatic changes trend. And if social media visibility drives patient flow, dramatic outcomes become unintentionally incentivized. And then something happens culturally. Something important happens culturally. The same platforms that rewarded volume begin to reward reversal. You hear people saying, I'm dissolving my filler journey. I'm going back to natural. I'm undoing everything that I've done. And now the cycle shifts again. Now, before there was expansion, now there's correction and minimalism, and it goes back to expansion. The market responds to what gets attention, which is why philosophy matters more than ever, because the syringe itself, again, is neutral. But without long-term vision, without an anatomical understanding, without complication management knowledge, the same tool can create very different outcomes. Once you see injectables as part of a broader economic ecosystem, you start to understand why trends accelerate the way that they do. So now let's talk about something that patients rarely think about: treatment menus. You go to a website, you see full face rejuvenation, liquid facelift, prevention package, membership pricing, skin club, or collagen boost series. Those aren't there accidentally. They're built. They've been built strategically. It took many smart business people who understand psyche and marketing strategies to have those there. Because once a practice understands its fixed cost, like its rent, its payroll, the devices it has, its inventory, it needs predictable revenue. Predictable revenue stabilizes a business. So how do you create predictability in an elective, cash-based industry? Well, you bundle, you package, you create tiers, you create memberships, you encourage membership maintenance cycles. Again, this is not sinister, right? Gyms do this, salons do this, subscription services do this, but this is also medicine. This is still medicine, and medicine inside a subscription model it behaves differently than medicine inside a hospital or inside when you're ordering clothes. When you create something like a full face rejuvenation package, you're doing something subtle. You're defining the problem broadly, not a line, not a shadow, but the entire face, the whole face. When you create a prevention plan at 25, you're expanding the market. You offer memberships, you're smoothing revenue. These are business strategies. They're smart ones, but they shape the language, and language shapes perception. So if you tell someone that they need a collagen baking program, that frames aging as something that must be actively defended against. If you say, we'll address the entire face, that frames aging as global. And framing matters because once a problem is defined broadly, solutions expand, and expanded solutions increase revenue. Again, not accusation, incentives. And here's something that's a little uncomfortable. When you sit in a consultation, you're not just sitting across from a clinician, you're sitting inside a business model. That doesn't mean that the clinician doesn't care. It just means that care and commerce coexist. And the structure around that clinician influences how recommendations are being delivered to you. If a practice is built on high volume, the consultation typically moves very quickly. If it's built on premium positioning, the consult usually feels more curated, it feels slower. If it's built on memberships, then maintenance is going to be emphasized. If it's built on dramatic transformation marketing, then larger treatment plans will feel more normalized. Different models, different energy, different outcomes, and the average patient often doesn't see the model. They only see the menu. But once you start to understand that the menus are engineered, not just curated, you start to listen a little differently. You start to ask, is this recommendation just about me? Is it personalized to me? Is it about my anatomy, my structure, or is it about the structure of this practice? And that question alone changes how you participate in aesthetic medicine. There's also another force that's shaping this industry, and it's probably the most powerful one in my opinion, social media, because aesthetic medicine, extremely visual, and visual industries behave very differently. So let's start with before and after photos. Most people assume that those images represent a fixed truth. They don't. Timing matters. For instance, immediately after filler, there's swelling. Immediately after neuromodulator like Botox kicks in, there's a peak smoothness. Immediately after laser, there can be a temporary tightening from inflammation. Lighting matters. Angles matter. The camera lens distortion matters. A slight shift in the jaw, a head tilt, that changes the jawline or the cheek structure. Overhead lighting, it softens structure. Side lighting tends to deepen structure and texture, and none of that is necessarily deceptive, but it is curated. And when you scroll through dozens of curated transformations, in seconds, your brain begins to recalibrate what normal really looks like. So there is a model, a social comparison theory that tells us that humans evaluate themselves relative to others. On Instagram, the others are filtered, they're lit, they're strategically selected, and modern research on image-based platforms shows higher appearance dissatisfaction the more time that users spend comparing. So now layer that on top of a multi-billion-dollar cash-based, fast-growing industry. You get rapid acceleration. And bring in influencer partnerships. I've personally been approached to participate in many influencer exchanges. Free treatment for visibility, product alignment for exposure, and I get the appeal. I've always asked myself the same question. If this patient weren't posting about it, would I still recommend it in the same way? This question in particular, it matters because once marketing enters the treatment room, even subtly, it influences tone. When a treatment goes viral, offices often feel pressure to offer it. When a dramatic transformation gains traction, subtlety becomes much harder to sell. When there's an influencer with perfect lighting says that something completely changed her life, the context, it disappears. And the part that no one wants to say out loud is that virality is not a credential. 1 million views doesn't equal anatomical mastery. A trending reel, it doesn't equal complication management. A beautifully curated grid on Instagram does not equal long-term vision. Social media rewards drama. Medicine, it requires restraint. And those two values don't always align. There's another layer that rarely gets discussed, and that's the internal pressure. No one talks about the business pressure inside aesthetic medicine, but it exists heavily. When an industry grows rapidly, expectations grow with it. There are revenue targets, there are expansion plans, second locations, additional providers, device upgrades, new service launches. Growth becomes the metric, and growth requires momentum. There's a constant push for new devices, new injectables, new protocols, new buzzwords, new bundles, because new sells. But medicine is not fashion. Faces don't need seasonal updates. And yet, in competitive market, novelty attracts attention. So practices feel this pressure to evolve constantly. Add into that memberships, create a subscription skin program, bundle in packages, offer tiered membership rejuvenation plans. Predictable revenue stabilizes a business, but predictable revenue can also subtly shape recommendations. And when a practice depends on memberships, maintenance is being emphasized. So also when expansion is underway, revenue must support the payroll. When a new device is being purchased, utilization, it has to justify it. So business pressure doesn't automatically create unethical behavior, but it does create momentum, and momentum can influence pace. And in aesthetic medicine, pace matters because business matters quickly. And when those speeds don't match, of a face changing slowly and a business moving quickly, there's a misalignment, tension forms. But most patients don't see ever that tension. They only see the recommendation that's in front of them. But once you understand that aesthetic medicine sits inside both medicine and a market pressure, you start to see the environment a little differently. You realize that providers are navigating more than just anatomy. They're navigating economics. They're navigating economics which require philosophy. So where does this leave us? Multi-billion-dollar industry, rapid growth, capital investment, inventory models, bundled menus, social media, exponential acceleration, the internal pressure for a practice to expand. And none of this makes aesthetic medicine wrong. It makes it powerful, and powerful industries require steady hands because businesses move quickly. Faces, again, do not. Faces change slowly. They age gradually. They hold history gradually, but the industry around them moves at a infinite speed. There are launch cycles. There are quarterly targets. There are trend waves. There are viral moments. And when those two speeds collide, philosophy becomes everything. It's not just skill alone. It's not just technology alone. It's the philosophy. It's the restraint. It's the long-term thinking, the ability to zoom out when the market is zooming in, the ability for a provider, for the physician to say, not yet, or to say less, or even to say, no, we have to wait. Even when acceleration would be much easier, because once you understand that incentives, you stop being surprised by trends. You stop being rushed by an urgency. You stop confusing visibility with mastery. Again, virality is not a credential, and momentum, it's not wisdom. The future of aesthetic medicine belongs to providers who understand both anatomy and economics, who can sit inside a business model without being driven entirely by it, who understand that growth is exciting, but integrity is stabilizing. Beauty will always be personal. It will always be emotional, but it also exists inside a system of capital, of marketing, growth, of insane competition, of momentum. And that makes it powerful. Powerful industries require discernment. Faces take time to change. So, as a physician in this, I think it's important for patients and for other providers in this field to start thinking long-term. We have to choose from a place of clarity instead of a place of urgency. This is not about rejecting the industry. It's about understanding it, because once you start to understand the business of beauty, you participate in it differently. So, In a fast-growing industry, speed, it's rewarded. But in a face, patience is rewarded. Know the difference. I'm Dr. Carol Eisenstat, and this is the Line Eraser.